They are the ties that bind, politically at least, and Paul Ryan is more captive than ever to President Donald Trump. Meanwhile, back in Wisconsin, one of the state's most divisive politicians, Sheriff David A. Clarke, is going to have a challenger if he decides to run for re-election in 2018. And Governor Scott Walker still says he won't take any of the additional federal dollars for health care for Wisconsin's poor, but he'd love to be able to drug test them. All that and more from Wisconsin's best political team today on OnPolitics. Welcome to OnPolitics for Thursday, March 30th. I'm David Haynes, the opinions editor at the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel. Well, last week, Paul Ryan suffered a serious political setback when his plan to replace Obamacare failed to attract enough votes in the House and had to be pulled. Now, the sting of that defeat is going to be felt for some time. I spoke with Craig Gilbert of our Washington Bureau about what happened and about what might come next. So, Craig, you wrote earlier this week that Paul Ryan, the House Speaker, is tied more than ever now to Donald Trump, and polling shows that, the Marquette University Law School poll. What did you mean by that? Explain that.
Well, this is the first time ever in Marquette's polling that Donald Trump has actually been more popular among Republican voters in Wisconsin than Paul Ryan in his own state. I mean, that is a massive change from a year ago. You remember Donald Trump was not very popular even in the Republican Party in Wisconsin for much of 2016. And also during much of 2016, the two had a very strained relationship. It was sort of a public breach. They criticized each other. In fact, Paul Ryan's popularity increased with people outside the Republican Party, like moderates and independents and liberals and Democrats. And I think partly because he was seen as a critic of Donald Trump. But since Donald Trump was elected president, the two have had a much warmer relationship. They've been trying to work together. Paul Ryan has really refrained from the kinds of criticisms of Donald Trump he made earlier. And Paul Ryan's numbers have actually improved as a result of that. He had lost ground among Republican voters when he was at odds with Trump, because Trump was becoming the dominant figure in his party, and now he is that dominant figure. And so Paul Ryan does not really have the luxury right now as House Speaker of being seen as a Donald Trump critic.
And Paul Ryan is more polarizing than he has been in the past, right?
Yeah, I mean, people are very polarized around Donald Trump, but they're polarized around most politicians in Wisconsin. Paul Ryan had been a notable exception to that. I mean, he had much better numbers among moderates and independents and Democrats and liberals than other Republican politicians, but he's lost ground among those groups. As I think, again, to return to the Trump factor, he's been so supportive of Donald Trump since Donald Trump's ascension to the White House, and Donald Trump is so unpopular outside the Republican base by and large. I think the price that Paul Ryan is paying for being House Speaker, for being the top Republican in Congress, but also for having a good relationship now with Donald Trump, is that he's looking more like other politicians. He's more polarizing. I mean, he's Democrats and liberals and moderates who did like him in the past or like some things about him, like less about him now.
So let's talk about the failure by the Republicans to agree on a plan to replace Obamacare. Is Paul Ryan in any real trouble as a result of that plan failing to get the votes it needed?
Well, he's in some trouble in the sense that, there's been a torrent of second guessing about the tactics, about the substance of the bill. But on the other hand, he still has the support of most of the conference. He still has the public support of Donald Trump, even if some Donald Trump supporters are pointing the finger of blame at Paul Ryan. And also the Republicans, Paul Ryan ended up in this job because his colleagues didn't really have any good alternatives, right, and they still don't have any obvious alternatives as Speaker. The problems in the Republican caucus are a little bit more fundamental. I think Paul Ryan probably accepts some well-deserved criticism over this chapter, but the problems are more fundamental in his Congress. There is no consensus right now among Republicans in Congress over how to replace Obamacare. As much as all the Republicans profess to hate Obamacare, that consensus doesn't exist, and the same internal problems among Republicans that have made the conference all but impossible to govern in the past for someone like John Boehner, are rearing their head under Paul Ryan.
And Ryan talked about at the press conference last week, we have to govern now. So next step seems to be to take on tax reform, but what are the odds there when you can't agree on Obamacare, something that they all appeared, at least in principle, to agree had to be done?
Yeah, there's two big problems. One is that they were relying on tax cuts in the Obamacare replacement plan to tee up their tax reform plan. In other words, they were going to be able to do about $1 trillion more in tax cuts because of the Obamacare replacement bill. And now that is no longer true, which means it's much harder to write a tax cut or tax reform plan just to make the math work. And on top of that, we all know that, some people think that reforming the tax code is the single hardest thing politically to do in Washington, because the winners and losers are so concrete. I mean, there are winners and losers in the healthcare replacement plan, but the winners and losers in tax reform are all there in black and white. And if you're going to cut taxes over on one side, they're going to have to go up to some degree over on the other side. And these winners and losers, are a source of division, not just across Congress, but again, within the Republican Party. It's a really, really, really heavy lift.
All right, Craig Gilbert, thanks so much.
Great to be with you.
So now I'm joined by Mary Spacuzza, a reporter for the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel, and Dan Bice, a columnist for the Journal-Sentinel. And let's stick with the Ryan story for just a minute. New poll out today, Dan. What's it say?
It's PPP, which is a Democratic-leaning poll, but reputable national pollster. They have new numbers nationally for Paul Ryan and Trump and for the health care plan. Ryan's job approval rating is now at 21%, which is incredibly low nationally, down from 35%, I think, 2 months ago. And the percentage of people who disapprove of the job that he's doing, 61%. So in Wisconsin, his job approval rating was right around 45%, so it's a little bit less than half of that.
When was the poll conducted, do you know?
It was done earlier this week.
So right after the failure.
After the failure. And the poll also asked to compare Obamacare with Ryan's plan, and the numbers were 49% preferred Obamacare to 28% who liked Ryan's plan. And asked what they thought of Ryan's plan, it was 23% who liked it and 56% who didn't. So the numbers are very similar. And coming out of this, even though Trump's numbers are down nationally, we've seen that his historically low for a president. Still, he's in the mid to upper 30s, close to 40%. Nothing like Ryan's numbers.
And Trump hasn't been criticizing him, which is interesting because some of the Trump allies and the Trump-friendly media have been calling on
you did a story
Paul
on
Ryan
everybody.
to step down. A Fox News host who Trump had just kind of trumpeted that day as tune in, and her first comments are about Paul Ryan should step down immediately. Some of the folks from Newsmax and places like Breitbart, Trump has not criticized him, so you kind of have to wonder what would his numbers be like if Trump had criticized him. Trump and Pence.
He doesn't need to.
Yeah,
clearly.
Yes, other people are, but it does. Yeah, it's. I think it's pretty remarkable when you see those polling numbers to see not only how unpopular Paul Ryan is, but how unpopular the plan that is everyone considers to be his, even though he said they worked on it together, also was. And multiple points were the points where people said I don't like this, I don't like this, I don't like this.
As Craig said, there's no indication that he's in jeopardy of losing the seat or in terms of losing the speakership, but this eroding support can obviously do damage.
Right. So is Trump sort of evading responsibility here for this plan that?
He has not said the buck stops with me. I failed to get the votes. He has not pointed the finger at Paul Ryan directly. He has at the Freedom Caucus, obviously, and talked about trying to defeat some of them in 2018, which is usually. Presidents are going after
the opposing
from
party.
The other party, not your own party. But I guess he is trying to pin the blame for the.
That actually
failure.
might be the opposing party in this.
Well, you remember that he likes to slap his name on everything from steaks to vodka to universities, and this was a plan that he didn't. I mean, he didn't go out and call this Trump care right away, which you expect, and he obviously didn't know some of the details. A number of stories point out in negotiations he was just not good at being able to say what was in there, and was very critical about those who got in the weeds to discuss the what's in the bill, but that's what you have to do in terms of negotiations with the Freedom Caucus.
So let's talk about another divisive politician, Sheriff David A. Clarke Jr.
Our own local Donald Trump.
Our own local version of a form of Trumpism, I believe, who supported Donald Trump. He now has what looks to be a fairly formidable challenger.
Right.
Dan, talk about that.
Ernell Lucas, who's a high-ranking official in Major League Baseball, he started here, started on the Milwaukee Police Force around the same time as Sheriff Clarke, and in fact, their career paths are very similar. They both became captains in the late 90s under Chief Jones, and they both left in 2002. Ernell left to become part of the security detail for Bud Selig when he was head of baseball. And he then became head of security, head of investigations, and now he's vice president of security and investigations. So he's risen through the ranks. I heard about 2 weeks ago that he was talking to various groups, labor groups and others, expressing an interest in running for sheriff. And then earlier this week, it turns out he's hired a local campaign team, Nation Consulting, to help him run against Clarke. Mm-hmm. So. Yeah, he would be a tough candidate. We don't know very much about his views on immigration or some of the other things, but clearly it's someone with good credentials who's knows Milwaukee. He lived in New York for a couple of years, is my understanding, but he's back here in Milwaukee. So Clarke has not said anything in response. Some of his supporters were dubious that Ernell was going to run, but I hear he's totally in. The main question is, will Clarke run for a 5th term? Mm-hmm. And right now we don't know. He's not giving any indications. There's talk that he might take a Trump job. There's talk that there are people pushing him to run against Tammy Baldwin, and there's the possibility that he just goes on the lecture circuit, where he's made a turned a good buck in the last couple of years doing that. So.
So we'll see. Let's turn now to an election that's coming up on Tuesday. We spoke with Anissa Johnson of the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel staff about the race for state superintendent. So Anissa, there's an election on Tuesday, and at the top of the ticket is the race for state superintendent, the person who will run the Department of Public Instruction in Wisconsin. Tony Evers is the incumbent. And why don't you tell me a bit about him and the challenger?
Well, Tony has been in office for 8 years. He's seeking a 3rd term. He is a longtime educator, just as is the challenger, Lowell Holtz. Tony, it's a nonpartisan race, but generally Tony has been supported by Democrats. He's a staunch, Democrats and teachers unions and labor groups. He's a staunch public school defender. He has fought the expansion of school choice and vouchers. But he also has said that that train has left the station. His job now is to ensure that all students, regardless of the sector they're in, get a quality education.
What about the challenger?
His challenger is Lowell Holtz. He also is an educator. He retired from the Whitnall School District, also was in Beloit. Formerly a Lutheran school teacher. He's a school choice advocate. He would expand the state voucher system. He has suggested that Tony has had his chance and has not moved the needle on academic performance of students, and it's time for somebody else to have.
Time for a change, you would say.
A change, yeah.
So what are a couple of the top issues that they seem to be talking about?
Well, obviously school choice is a huge issue. School funding. Yesterday or this week at Marquette, Lowell suggested that more money doesn't improve schools, and Evers has asked for an additional $700 million this year for schools. Lowell would eliminate Common Core. Tony has said school districts adopt this on their own. He would change the state tests.
And he was in place, Evers was when Common Core took effect.
He was, and he supported it. Yeah. He supported it. Lowell has said that academic performance has languished and worsened under Evers. Evers has said it's not as bad as his critics would say, that they've made advances on graduation, they've raised standards, and they raised the bar for what it means to be proficient, and that in some ways makes things look worse than they are.
They've kind of changed the cut scores and so forth. So there was some thought going back a few months that this might be a fairly contentious race, and that you might see a lot of outside money coming in to support either candidate. Has that happened?
Well, they're getting money, but Evers has far outpaced Holtz in what he's drawn, and he's drawn it from the traditional sources, the PACs, the teachers' unions, and so on. There was some suggestion that that Lowell would see, or the conservative candidate would see money from outside groups, dark money perhaps, that are interested in pushing school choice or education reform, and that doesn't appear to have really materialized. His donors are primarily Republican Party organizations, Republican business folks that E-Lines have given generously, and some Republican lawmakers.
All right. So thanks so much. We have a primer on the state superintendent's race, and we'll have to see what happens next Tuesday. Anissa Johnson with the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel.
Thank you.
And now we're going to speak with Jason Stein of the Journal-Sentinel's Madison Bureau. Jason spent the night at the Joint Finance Committee last night, and he has an update on how the budget deliberations are going. We'll go to Jason right now. So, Jason, you were at a Joint Finance Committee meeting last night. But
I had that privilege, yes.
Yeah, it sounds like you just got out of it, actually, this morning.
It was all the way to midnight I had that privilege.
Oh, my gosh. But before we get to what happened last night, let's talk about Governor Walker's request to the Trump administration on Medicaid. He's requesting the ability to drug test recipients. At the same time, with Obamacare now, the repeal of Obamacare now apparently on hold, some states that didn't take the extra Medicaid money are rethinking that, but apparently Governor Walker is not. So touch on both those, if you would, please.
Right. Well, some Republicans in my home state of Kansas, for instance, are trying to take the Medicaid expansion. You know, you see some talk in Congress like they might take another run at repealing Obamacare, but it's really pretty uncertain what would happen with that. So now the action is really all in state capitals, where it has been for many years, but where we thought it was finally shifting to Congress. Now it seems like it's still here in state houses. Walker wants to make a number of changes to the Medicaid program that the Obama administration, just would not have allowed. He hopes that the Trump administration will, and those changes include drug testing recipients. They include introducing things like health risk assessments that, I think many of our viewers might be familiar with from private sector health insurance. Things like premiums, monthly premiums for Medicaid members. But again, some of these things it'll be interesting to see how they apply to someone who, it doesn't have a job necessarily, may have income of $3,000 or $4,000 a year. Some of these things may be difficult to translate into the life of someone in that situation.
All right, so let's talk about that long meeting last night. And first, the transportation issue. Apparently, there's still a lot of discussion about what to do about paying for roads in this state. So what happened last night? Right.
Well, what you see is that both sides on that issue are just digging deeper and deeper, sort of like a pothole, if you will. The governor actually, in the middle of the meeting last night, tweeted that he would veto any tax increase, which was sort of the strongest language we've seen from him, because he has gradually went from saying, well, I could accept some new gas taxes if you cut some other taxes, to saying, you know what, I know I said that, but actually I really don't want any gas tax at all under any circumstance. And then you have Republicans, especially those in the Assembly, saying, look, Governor, we'd like to run. One of them said last night that he'd like Republicans to be the governing party of Wisconsin for many years to come. But he said, if we can't eventually meet the needs in areas like roads, we may not be able to achieve that. So they really just fundamentally have a disconnect with one another, the governor and his GOP, some of his GOP colleagues in the legislature.
So let's talk about the issue of insurance for state employees, too. That may seem like an issue that's far away from many of our viewers.
It may seem like the boringest issue in the world, and maybe
Right.
it is, but the reality is that the state has tens of thousands of employees. One of our biggest costs as taxpayers is giving them health care. And it turns out that in some places like Madison, too, there are so many state employees that what you do with their health coverage really affects everyone who lives there potentially, because it can move the market. And what the Walker administration wants to do, they want to drop our system of having HMOs and just essentially have the state insure itself, which is kind of a fancy way of saying have the state pay its own health insurance, health visit bills, doctors' visit bills for its employees. And they've tried now 2 or 3 times to do this. And with a very big run happening right now, it seems like Republican lawmakers are going to reject that, because they were very, very negative on that proposal when it came before them this week.
All right, Jason Stein, thanks so much. Try to get some rest.
Thanks, Dave. I'll do my best.
And now it's time for that part of the show that everyone enjoys, winners and losers, except maybe the losers. Dan, let me go to you first. Who's your winner?
My winner is Kevin Nicholson, somebody that most people won't know. He's running for U.S. Senate, or it looks like he's running for U.S. Senate.
Like it.
And today there's a super PAC called Solutions for Wisconsin that announced that it has $2 million in hand already. The money seems to have come from Dick Uline, who runs the Uline packaging store. So if and when he gets into the race, this money's already there to spend. And Dick, it's actually Dick Uline who runs Uline packaging. He was a big spender last year. I think he was the 9th biggest donor nationally, having spent more than $20 million in various races around the state, and clearly he has an interest in this race.
Is he trying to clear the field?
I think it's probably early to do that, but we also have another candidate, Carolyn Snyder, who's interested in running from the Snyder trucking family. So there are other people with money who plan to run. Eric Hovde might run as well. So I don't think they're thinking about clearing the field. It's trying to say this guy, Kevin Nicholson, is going to be competitive. He's going to be there in the end. So.
Okay. So who's your loser?
My loser's Attorney General Brad Schimel, who had an entertaining and probably not very good appearance before the Joint Finance Committee yesterday, where he's criticizing public employees for their work ethic. He's having to defend a settlement with 3M in which he levied no fines at all for them, which is a growing trend. And he also spent a lot of time defending his agency model, kicking ass every day, and spending $10,000 on the commemorative coin. So there should be good clips for whoever runs against him during that session.
Right, some ready-made ads there. All right,
probably
Mary.
came up since those were your stories. Right?
Yeah.
All right, Mary, who's your loser of the week?
Originally, I was going to say Paul Ryan, but I think we covered that ground pretty thoroughly. So I decided to go with Reince Priebus, who, as you remember, another Wisconsinite, when he was tapped to be chief of staff for Trump, the talk was that he was going to help Trump, who didn't have much political experience, with all of these politicians and Republicans. He obviously ran the RNC for years, helped a lot of these folks get elected.
Things like shepherding legislation
Things
through
like
the
shepherding
Congress.
major legislation like the health care bill that tanked. And so, in the wake of it, obviously there were the calls to have Paul Ryan resign, but there have also been questions about who should replace Reince Priebus. There was a recent Associated Press story that said, basically since the beginning of Trump's administration, it seems like there's constantly, almost every week, a kind of should Reince Priebus be replaced? Right. So I think that kind of lingering questions did not get any better after last
So are there still these
collapse.
two poles in the White House, sort of the Bannon group and the Priebus group, or is that got all mixed up?
You know, when that story about the kind of all the stories about the Bannon versus Priebus in the White House, they really tried to squash those and show how well they were working together. I don't know at this point whether it is those two versus each other, or, you know, obviously Trump might be trying to figure out who to point the finger at when he's looking at blame for this.
Hey, everybody took a hit because of the health care.
Yeah.
So
That was bad for everybody. So who is your winner this week?
I wrestled with that one, and I decided to go with Tim Cullen, who is not going to be governor, but decided to get out of the race now versus later. I think he would have had a hard time winning statewide. He, you know, obviously a
Former state senator from Janesville,
right,
well respected.
Very well respected. You know, had a career in the health field. Left the legislature, went back to the legislature. Now left the legislature again. But I think it would have been a very tough battle for him to win. He cited the fundraising and just the money it would take to run for governor, but I think it was probably a good move to get out when he did.
you could also say Governor Walker's a winner, as the list of potential opponents
Keeps shrinking.
shrinking. Yeah, no formidable opponent for him right now.
Right.
Right. Just on that point, quickly, Dan, how long do the Democrats have to figure that piece out? Walker looks vulnerable.
Yeah, but you know he's actually gaining traction, and I think it depends on how much money you have as to you know, when you get into the race. If it is somebody who's going to have to raise a lot of money, like Cullen, he said he was going to have to spend 4 hours on the phone every day fundraising just to be competitive. So if it's someone with a lot of money, I mean, I think they could probably get in late this year. But if it's someone without, the clock is ticking.
And also, if it looks like it might be somebody without name recognition, unless somebody steps forward that we haven't heard of yet, and so it takes a while to, you know, get people to know who you are, even if you do have money. So I don't think you want to wait so long that all of a sudden, you know, you're pouring tons of money, but people are just, you know,
The one advantage is just about anybody running against Scott Walker is going to have 40 to 43% of the electorate right away. But
the anti-Scott Walker vote, right?
which is established and turns out and whatever. But that's obviously, as Mayor Barrett knows, not enough to win an election. So, so yeah, as I said, the clock is ticking.
All right, well, let's go to a couple of reader questions. Actually, you answered one of the ones that I was going to ask you from a reader about what the Democrats might need to look for in a candidate. But let's go to another one about Sheriff Clarke's potential opponent. Dan, you talked about Mr. Lucas. And the question is, the person running against Sheriff Clarke, so what are his viewpoints on crime, on immigration? How close is he in terms of management style to Sheriff Clarke? Do we know anything about Ernell Lucas?
I mean, we know some things. We know his resume, and it's an impressive resume. We know that he's been talking with labor groups. I think any election against Sheriff Clarke is going to be a referendum on Sheriff Clarke, but I think the fact that he's getting out now, a year and a half before the election, I'm sure we're going to find out all of those things. He doesn't, just in a quick background check, he doesn't seem to have any litigation against him, no bankruptcies, that sort of stuff. But I think this is one of those things where you have to wait and see. We're gonna find out much more about Ernell. I mean, right now, even his campaign team was saying, we're still putting this thing together. Yeah. We're not even ready to announce. I just wrote the story to get ahead of the curve and to let people know that he was planning to run. And
he's running as a Democrat to challenge him, so presumably he would be to the left of Sheriff Clarke on some of those issues, as most Democrats would be.
Probably, but also he would prefer that the race be nonpartisan, like a lot of people, because it doesn't make a lot of sense to run as a Republican or a Democrat on as sheriff. So that's their position. But yeah, he is running as a Democrat.
All right, one final question. So, Mary, I'll turn this over to you.
Okay.
The question is, I don't remember that the state superintendent race was ever that big of a race until recently. How much power does that position really have? And does it matter if the person is conservative or liberal? Again, I think this is a nonpartisan race, or supposed to be.
Right.
but it clearly is not, at least this time around, with one side, Tony Evers, having support from traditionally Democratic groups, and the other having support from more conservative groups. So.
I think, in the wake of Act 10, educators have gotten far more interested in statewide races, especially after, the collective bargaining. A lot of the protesters at the Capitol that we saw were Wisconsin teachers. I think they're paying very close attention to this race, partly in the wake of that, in the wake of some of the funding cuts that we've seen to public schools, and the feeling that voucher schools are benefiting under Governor Walker while public schools are suffering. Obviously, Governor Walker is sending more money, or planning to send more money to public schools. But I think that there's just a lot of interest in that race, partly because of the broader, what we've seen in the last 6 years when it comes to public education.
I think it started becoming political in the 90s. I've been around obviously longer than you have, but when there was a candidate, Linda Cross, ran her entire campaign on I'm going to manage the schools like a business, and was very much the candidate of school choice. I think it's when Governor Thompson introduced school choice that it became a race between, on one side, the teachers union and the school choice forces. And, there's been some ebb and flow, but that's what the race has been ever since.
So when we spoke with Anissa earlier, she said that not much sign of outside money coming into that race. Is that an indication that conservatives who thought they might have a chance to unseat Evers have decided they don't?
Well, I think the primary is probably what did that, because Evers was so strong, and the third candidate, who did receive a fair bit of money from outside and money from the Walker establishment, just got crushed. Didn't even get 10% of the vote. Mm-hmm. So there's no reason to pour money into that when there are going to be a number of races on bigger issues coming up, including, the Supreme Court race next year, which is expected to be a huge race.
All right.
Yeah, I think people are a little stingier when they see that kind of margin in the primary that they...
Big hill to climb.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thanks a lot for joining us on Politics, and thanks to my colleagues Dan Bice, Mary Spacuzza, Jason Stein, and Craig Gilbert, and Anissa Johnson. Thanks for joining us.